Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's podcast on the Africa we want. And in today's episode, we have Becky who is joining us as a guest, and we have Chido. And what we are discussing today is the topic of protection of Africa digital market. I will introduce it a bit more, but then I'll give Chido a chance to introduce herself, say hi, and Becky. Then we get started.
Thank you so much, Christine. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. As Christine has said, my name is Chido, and it's good to be back again for this week's episode where we are talking about a topic that is very dear to me. I really enjoy talking about digital trade, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Cool. Thanks, Chido.
Hi everyone, I'm Becky. I'm happy to be here this evening and looking forward to this conversation. I'm also very, very interested in e-commerce precisely. So I'm looking forward to see how this conversation goes, to share the knowledge and raise certain questions that will help us keep thinking about what could be better and what's ahead for Africa.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot, Becky. And so, when you speak about like the digital market, just to give it a brief background, when you speak about the digital market, what we're really saying is that, like platforms that we know about, Netflix, Amazon, Facebook, Google, like the big ones, which you will find operating in most African countries, but then also think about like Uber, Bolt, so such platforms. And what we really are speaking about is the Africa market, especially, is such a ripe place for these platforms to come in. For what reasons? First, because you see, it's an untapped market. Like you find some in some African countries that there's even no like online Uber service, or cab service. I mean, there's no online like shopping. So it's a market that's ripe to be tapped, and that people would take advantage of if given the option to, especially when it's bringing convenience and it's helping give connections. Like, but to be fair, that there are some platforms which are already very well used, especially Facebook within Africa, and so it's quite an interesting topic to have a discussion on. So let me first go with our guest Becky. When you think about like the digital trade within Africa, like use of e-commerce platforms, what in your observations and what does it look like for Africa?
Well, I think the first thing is to begin on an optimistic note that things are not looking very bad. They could be better, but looking at the trajectory, especially the last, say, 7 years or so, things are looking up. So, for instance, just some few numbers is that the expected revenue in 2021 is around 25 trillion US dollars. And there's expected to be an annual growth of 13.3%. So things are expected to nearly double by 2025. So things are looking up. Although when we put that into perspective of how the rest of the world is performing globally, to be honest, Africa is dismally performing. Just for perspective, the Chinese market is the biggest. China is the biggest e-commerce market at 1.2 trillion, and followed by US at nearly half of that, 400 and something million. Well, when you think about our population, we are at 1.2 billion. China has 1.3 billion, but Africa, if you listen to what we are talking about, 25 million US dollars, and China is talking about 14.3 trillion. So we are not doing well comparatively, but of course we know that we have a lot of differences. But because we're talking about going forward, and things have really been not just in e-commerce, but things have really been accelerating very quickly in Africa. So let's forget the past about how we've been left behind. We are looking at the trend over the last couple of years and thinking about how quickly things are changing. So the growth in the market itself, the expected revenue, it's both are expected to double. So I mentioned that the revenue is expected to rise by 13.3%, and the valuation of the e-commerce market itself is expected to rise from, I think the latest valuation was 16.5 billion, and it's expected to rise to approximately 75 billion by 2025. So things are expected to, I don't know what this kind of growth is. It's not even exponential. It's like literally leapfrogging stages of growth. Because when you look at the last 5 years, the growth within the last 5 years, and then the growth that is expected in the next 5, it's barely comparable. So things are not very good when we compare ourselves right now to the global picture, but things are expected to get better. There are several things that are helping us on that front. It's the internet access, and internet is becoming both more accessible and cheaper. And then you have quite a steady growth of the middle income earners. So people generally have a little bit more of disposable income. And there are also other solutions. I think there some might come up in the later in the discussion, but there are solutions that are more like homegrown to some of our problems, especially with e-commerce. Some innovations like what Nigeria is doing in terms of delivery. So one of the biggest problems in Africa with e-commerce is how to deliver things to people, because we don't have marked addresses and things like that. But there are certain innovations now, like this new navigation technology called What 3 Words. So instead of using the normal GPS, there is a whole new system that is helping to identify places, that has marked places. I don't want to get into the technical description of how the technology works, but it basically works in places that are totally unmarked or very poorly marked, where normal GPS would not take you there. So I think things are going well. Growth is there in several things that are pushing our economies in the right direction, and also innovations that are good for like matching the need or the problems of the African market.
Wow. Okay. Thanks for that, Becky. That's quite interesting. Chido, if I may ask, and my view, especially on these platforms, as much as for Africa to actually uh, get a good stake of it, it's for entrepreneurship and some of these platforms to actually be owned within Africa, or for Africa to come up with solutions of their own. So, Chido, if you could speak about like this entire topic, and like all these revenues are being projected to be earned out of this market, but how much of this is actually going to be retained in Africa as funds for Africa from Africa, and not be, shipped out of Africa, and someone else is actually getting all these profits out?
Thank you for the question, Christian. So basically, I'll start by saying, as an individual, when I hear about e-commerce or digital trade, basically, I pretty much start thinking about three things, right? The first thing being the increase in trade volumes. The second being how the digital platforms pretty much connect the previously unconnected to the global markets. And by the previously unconnected, I'm really referring to, your startups, your MSMEs, right? So with this increase of market and the opportunities that are coming up, and all these other things, I felt like the very first thing that we need to do as a continent to ensure that we get to reap the benefits, it comes down to having comprehensive policies and legal frameworks, right? So I would really start my argument by saying we need to, when we get into these other regional trade agreements, we now need to take the whole concept of e-commerce seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very sad that even when we were negotiating the ACTA,
Mm-hmm.
the protocol on e-commerce was more or less like an afterthought. We thought about trade in goods, we thought about trade in services and all that, but we forgot e-commerce, because actually trade in goods and services nowadays, because of this evolution with technological advancement, we can't really talk about it without digital trade. So I feel that our starting point has to be making sure that we've got the regulatory framework that actually enables us to reap the benefits that are supposedly supposed to accrue by way of digital trade. And maybe to just comment on something that Becky had said about the disparities in statistics when you look at Africa Europe and China. I think it has a lot to do with the digital divide. All right. So it's very sad that as a continent, we really still lagging behind when it comes to industrialization, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now we are talking about the fourth industrial revolution, where we are now looking at adopting what we are knowing as disruptive technologies. We're talking about artificial intelligence, blockchain, all these other things that are pretty much going to push forward digital trade. And I feel that we are already late to join the bandwagon, because right now we're still talking about construction of roads, we're still talking about infrastructure, right? Probably the second revolution. And when we are there, while the whole world is actually looking towards ways to ensure that they accept or they embrace these emerging technologies to ensure that they drive economic growth. So I feel that because of that, we're already at a disadvantage, and the gap keeps widening between Africa and all these other countries. And because of the widening gap, what will probably end up happening is that when we start having these, preferential trade agreements, regional trade agreements with the countries or the regions that are already ahead of us, they are going to exploit us. For us to then sort of cushion ourselves from the possible exploitation, it all comes back now to a robust regulatory framework that I was talking about. And the sad reality is that most African countries, when they get into preferential trade agreements or regional trade agreements, especially with, you talk of Asian countries, you talk of Europe and the US, they are not really focusing on e-commerce. They look at, other things that pertain to the physical movement of goods and services, not actually acknowledging that the world is moving from that. You understand? Like we're not really picking up to the evolution. And if you go back to the World Trade Organization framework, how there is no protocol in e-commerce to date, it has a lot to do with the reluctance of African countries to actually sit down and negotiate a protocol in e-commerce, because we are still stuck on the DDA, the Doha Development Agenda. We're still trying to talk about market access. We're still trying to talk about agriculture and subsidies and all these other issues, when the rest of the world is really moving towards e-commerce. So even if you look at the statistics of the existing agreements, you'd realize that when the focus shifts to Africa, it's like it goes down. We don't have those agreements.
Yeah. And Chido, I wouldn't agree more, especially because right now you see that there are bilateral agreements that are being signed by African countries, like whether it's Mauritius, whether it's Kenya, whether with whichever other countries. These agreements you'd expect, as much as they are dealing with things like, access to your market for physical goods. Right now, like some of the biggest markets, what you do, especially if you want to buy a book, right now you just download it. You get an ebook, you get it on Kindle, and then you just download it to yourself and you get it. So there's a lot of trade, and it's both trade in goods, what you're saying, but also there's trade in services. There's a lot of that that's going on purely online, and especially with after the COVID situation, and especially like over the whole of 2020, most of businesses have gone online, or they're trying to advance themselves, their online presence, and to trade more online. And I think that's like a big concern that I would have. Maybe the good thing about it is that maybe there's a bit of time, because when you look a bit of time in the sense that not everyone within Africa has adopted tech and these online services as much as like the US, Europe, and China. Like there's almost like an untapped market. There are people, there's a good population of people who are not using some of these services. But the problem is that if we are not ahead of it, so that we have laws, so that we have, like negotiate for these things, how should infrastructure be laid out in Africa? Like if someone is going to lay down the fiber optic cables that are going to supply internet, or when, until we negotiate for these things in advance, we will not realize until it's too late how much that we missed on. And so I think, Becky, what do you think about this? I think we've changed the situation and gone more to discuss on the trade and, like the WTO rules and the bilateral agreements. But with the onset of the fourth industrial revolution, which took off, it gained momentum. It's really fast, and the knowledge economy, which is driving the creation of wealth in the world. what really do you think is like things that Africa should be negotiating for when they're on the table, let's say for instance with China? Is this something that they should start pushing for, and what exactly should they be pushing for?
Um, First of all, definitely, I totally agree with Chido's concerns about the current lack of elaborate plans on how e-commerce will be carried out. And I think my first concern, and the main one really, is that the fact that we are not planning for e-commerce means that all this growth that we are talking about, and I think you mentioned that in the initial question to Chido, was who's going to benefit from this growth? Where is this revenue going to go? And the fact that we don't have proper regulatory frameworks and other policies that will govern e-commerce means there is a very good chance that other people with interests will come into the market and take advantage, because in a free market kind of environment, someone will enter the market. And as a fast mover, like right now, and the reason I actually feel my worry is this: the main e-commerce markets, or the main players in the developed countries, they are reaching maturity phase. They're in the maturity phase where the market is saturated now. You have like 90 something percent of citizens using e-commerce. So there isn't any further that you can go within a particular country. And your main players in that area would be like Amazon and AliExpress. It's absolutely impossible to right now, unless some regulations are put in place, to compete against these giants. So what happens when they reach saturation in their markets? You think they're just going to stop? They are looking out for the world for where else can we extend our business to, in whatever manner. They might not come here as AliExpress or Amazon. So what is going to happen if we are caught off guard in that we have not put regulatory safeguards in place that will ensure that this growth that we are projecting benefits us and not entrants from other places? That is my main concern when I think about e-commerce. The fact that there are certain skills that we need to develop, because all these platforms being implemented, there is a certain skill set that we need in entrepreneurs to know how to take their market, to take their products online. You need a whole ecosystem of developers, of payment systems. There is just a whole lot that is needed. And as Chido was saying, this takes very well thought out policy, which is then implemented. So in the absence of this, someone who already has that expertise is very likely to look at that market. We are talking about a market that is going to more than double in the next 4 years. So someone who's already done that elsewhere, they know in this, the only thing they need to do is literally just contextualize. Just think what's unique about this market. What are the biggest challenges? And as I mentioned, the biggest challenge, maybe if Amazon wants to come and run their business here, the biggest hurdle they would face is, how do we deliver things to people? People don't have addresses. That's a very easy thing to solve now. So we are likely to be caught off guard if something is not done between. I mean, it's late, as Chido mentioned. So we are running behind of time if we want to keep these coming revenues within Africa to benefit us, so that we develop this skill set, which means creation of jobs, we empowering more entrepreneurs to increase their revenues by taking their products online. And now with we are talking about even taking cross borders, their products cross border. So there is a gap there, which definitely makes it a concern of should we celebrate yet that growth has been projected. We might get that growth, but the revenues might not be with us.
Okay, and I agree, and especially because my mind works a lot on the tax side, I would especially say, first from what you said on, imagine like what MSME that will be trying to compete in the next 2 years, like they are starting to try and compete against Amazon once Amazon figures how to deliver within, let's say, a country like Uganda. And then let's say like a young business is just coming up, someone has just figured out how to do like a small delivery kind of thing and offer I don't know what kind of service, and maybe it will be impossible. I think that's a situation which you are looking at. It's like once someone was giving an example and saying that someone had just started figuring out how to do business of like transporting people, and like having an Uber version but on a very localized scale. And then Uber came in, and the thing they explained is that Uber ate his lunch. So it was just that's like what we are dealing with. It's like in the coming years, unless like there's empowerment of these like small businesses competing with the big giants once they are within Africa, it's just going to be literally impossible. And it's because they have the financing, they have deep pockets, and so they can try out more things. And then as an MSME, like first of all, like the period within which it has to wait to break even, that alone is long enough to kill the business. And then it's Africa. Financing for MSMEs is a problem. So who is even going to finance that and wait until you turn over your profit? But then also now from a tax perspective, which is like the thing I'm always saying, is that taxing the digital economy for Africa is a problem. Because once you tell, like for instance, it's reported by the Africa Tax Administration Forum, they've been trying to like look at like what are the best rules to use to tax Africa, and other administrative forums that are and development forums that are trying to see what's the best solution for Africa and suggesting it. Like noting like Uganda has been trying to tax Facebook, but then you pass the rules and you're like, whenever you use Facebook and Facebook, like you advertise on Facebook and you pay Facebook a fee, then Facebook should remit a certain amount of tax, whether it's VAT to Uganda. Facebook doesn't do that. And the thing they ask you is that, what will you do? Where can you find that? You're not registered in your country. How do you even enforce against us? Because the traditional means of enforcing against someone who doesn't pay tax within your country is that you either freeze their bank accounts or you just like take their financial assets. Most of these digital MNEs don't have physical registrations in most African countries. And now the biggest thing is that the advertising that would have gone to the traditional mainstream media, like to the televisions and radio stations within Africa, now it's going to YouTube and it's going to these other platforms. If you think about it, you no longer even you subscribe to Netflix. No one even knows. But then the governments within Africa, they're trying to chase after this revenue and saying, you guys need to register within like Kenya. But what motivation does Netflix have to register in Kenya? If you're too hard on Netflix in Kenya, the market is so small for them. They'll just pack up and leave. But I think these are some of the policy challenges that the thing that Africa stands to lose is not just like the profits of like entrepreneurs and MSMEs not being able to compete, but tax revenue itself is going to be a problem. And then that's when the government possibly will just push for more employment taxes or something, because the government has to keep being financed, because the traditional businesses by then will not be making enough profits. But anyway, Chido, I could go on and speaking about this. But what do you think? Like especially when you speak about policy, what are some of the things like you think about and say, surely Africa, you could do this either collectively or each individual African country, and especially through the after. Like, what do you think about that?
Before I speak about that, I wanted to point out something that I've noticed in a number of countries. The problem that happens is we have got the brains, we have got the ideas, but we lack government support. And by government support, I'm not really talking about financial support. Yes, financial support is important, but what happens is more often than not, we have got this brilliant young people coming up with, ideas, setting up social media platforms, online applications and everything, but they are not supported enough. So what happens is they approach governments for funding, and instead of them being funded, the project is then taken and given to probably a big enterprise, which then does not bring out the idea or the innovative idea that the person had initially when they started it. Mm-hmm. I know a specific friend who actually was trying to launch this platform. It's an interactive platform for students where they share course materials and everything. But because he does not have funding, and when he tried to approach these other big companies for funding and whatever, it didn't go so well. And currently, that's a project that is sitting on something that could possibly be generating something that could even be putting the whole continent on a pedestal. You understand what I'm saying? Because if you look at those other platforms that we're talking about Alibaba, we're talking about Facebook, we're talking about Netflix. They started small and they became bigger. So we also need to come up with those ideas. We also need to have our own platforms that that become used worldwide, so that we can also start reaping the benefits of having of this technological advancement. And I also wanted to say that when you going back to the question that you asked about policies, right? So I feel like the first thing that we need to do as individual countries is that whenever we are we start by saying this. Now that we are part of a collective group, we are talking about the AFTA, and we're no longer negotiating as individuals. The first thing that we need to do is we need to have our very own protocol in e-commerce that regulates e-commerce within the continent. So every company that knows it wants to do business in Africa, electronic business, be it digital trade or anything, they know they are governed by the e-commerce protocol. And what makes it even more important, Christine, goes back to the idea that there is no e-commerce protocol within the World Trade Organization framework. And part of it has been because of all these other arguments about customs duties on e-services and electronic goods, the bundling of goods, and all these other things, right? Because generally speaking, digital trade blurs the distinction between goods and services and all these other things, which basically makes the existing legal framework obsolete. So what we need to do is to have our own framework that is very contextual, that speaks to the needs of the continent. So some of the other provisions that I think would be very important, given that we lack technological tools. We are not. We probably can't have blockchains in Africa. It's difficult. We can't have all these other things. Why don't we then, if we're doing partnerships with companies that are already existing, the technological giants, at least we need to have a stick in the game, right? So if you're coming to Africa, I like what Uganda is trying to do to tax Facebook, to tax the internet, because ultimately we also need to reap a benefit. So we need to have a framework that regulates how that is done. So the e-commerce protocol then talks about taxation. It talks about how to regulate the new markets and all these other things. And another thing, if you look at what has been happening in the previous months, you see that China, the US, and the UK have been singling out African countries, getting into regional trade agreements with them. We need to make sure that we have got e-commerce provisions in those regional trade agreements, in those preferential trade agreements, in those bilateral trade agreements. Because like I'm saying, if you look at how much e-commerce has been accelerated, especially by the COVID-19 pandemic, you would realize that by the time we probably get to 2022, all these other existing rules that we have will become obsolete. So we have people getting into an untapped market within our continent, getting all this revenue, reaping the benefits, and taking it outside of the continent without us benefiting anything, because we have nothing that regulates the relationship. It's very funny that I feel like generally there's this reluctance to actually embrace e-commerce within the continent, because if you look at it, the e-commerce agenda itself, it was captured in the AU Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, the one that we were talking about last week, which has not yet entered into force, regardless of the fact that it was signed it was launched in 2014, right? And there was the AU Digital Transformation Strategy and all these other things. When we go to the AU as African countries, we agree on these issues. For a fact, we say they're important. But I don't know, there is this gap that still exists. So even if we have an e-commerce protocol, even if we have these provisions and all those other things, I feel like they are not going to be, in a way, implemented. They're not going to be helpful because we lack the willpower. We still think that we need to really deal with physical. We're still trying to catch on those other physical aspects of physical trade that we feel we're lagging behind, but we're not really trying to embrace the change and move with the tide.
But Chido, I like what you're saying, and the thing that you just said, and I thought, wow, is when you said that Africa needs to even develop solutions that can be used elsewhere in the world. Like we could come up with a solution that is from Africa, but it's being used in the US and the UK. And then, Becky, I even thought to ask, especially right now, the global value chains, like what's happening is that you find that Apple or whoever is doing, it's, like they try and have different things done in different places in the world and then bring and assemble whatever they're doing together. Rarely will you hear there's even like a focus in Africa where they are outsourcing some of their big functions. If it's India, they will outsource their call centers and such things. But within Africa, it's really not only are we not even developing solutions for ourselves, but you wonder how likely is it even that we develop solutions from Africa that are digitally, like up to date and they're working that we can export to other continents. It feels like we are so far off. But even Chito, what you're saying on like countries that go and negotiate for bilateral agreements by themselves, for instance, like the Mauritius and China FTA, you'd think that if there's a protocol within the AU that says something like on e-commerce, at the very least, let Mauritius adapt some of those provisions and put it in the bilateral agreement that's going to negotiate with China. If Kenya is going to do that with the UK, if it's for even the lack of a template, or like there's a think tank, the AU has passed like the agreement we were speaking about last week, adopt some of those provisions and put them in the bilateral agreement. But the thing, as you say, within Africa, it's almost like every country is trying, I don't know, to chase for its own and look out for itself, but it's really not working because Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, they're all trying to tax the digital economy. I don't know if there's anyone succeeding because that's the whole thing. The OECD itself, they're trying to figure it out how to tax the digital economy. But within Africa, everyone is trying to do their own thing. It's really not working. But Becky, what are your thoughts about all these things you're saying, especially about like integrating Africa within the global value chains and such kind of things, especially within the digital side?
It's actually interesting the example you gave of when big companies are thinking about where do we get ABC, Africa doesn't appear. And the irony is much of the like raw material that they need, like for example, to assemble an iPhone. So the irony is that we are the ones producing this material, but we don't know anything about, even probably if you ask some of the people that do the mining, they have no idea whatever they mine does or where it fits in the larger global economy. So we have several problems, and I think the greatest problem, in my opinion, has always been lack of value addition. Because imagine if we were able to do even the slightest of value addition to many of the things that we are producing, it would make economic sense for someone to say that if cobalt or whatever goes into the batteries is being produced in Central Africa and it's being processed a little bit there, then it's cheaper for me to have a factory in Congo where the batteries are produced rather than that material leaves Africa on a ship to I don't know what country, and then the battery is created and then it travels to another country where the phone is being created, being assembled. If we had even the slightest level of value addition in many of the raw materials we produce, there is an incentive for big companies to look at the cost of transporting these things after a little value has been added, which means they're now slightly more expensive. But since for most of the things produced in Africa, the natural resources, they just live on ships raw as they come from the ground. So there is really no incentive for any country to localize their business here. So I hope that with a lot of the things that are trying to be implemented, I hope that really takes off. Like looking at how can we create like a value addition chain in literally every sector, not just with regards to things that involve electronics. So that is the challenge and it has a lot of other implications, including the skills that you're going to build and creating jobs and all sorts of other ripple effects. So that's that. And my other comment, and Chido mentioned it, was when I think about the growth of e-commerce, there is another huge risk if there is no appropriate policy. And the sad thing, as Chido has observed, is it's not like we don't have policies. For example, the issue of personal data and cybersecurity in general. The more people are going to the internet and shopping in the internet, unless you have proper personal data protection and other cybersecurity things in place, it's going to be total mayhem. And the sad thing is, if these policy documents keep gathering dust somewhere and they're not being implemented, but the growth that is being projected is continuing to happen. More and more people, like today, several hundreds of thousands of people have new smartphone users have been added to the numbers, and tomorrow they're going to be ordering things online and things like that. So it's a hard thing, and I really don't know what to say about it, because it's sort of we have that track record as a continent. Like, we have very good policies on paper, but then they don't get implemented, and also that whole issue of countries thinking, I'm probably a little bit superior, so I can negotiate my own thing. Because my comment on that was, it's definitely a lot better to negotiate as a bloc. Look at the kind of things that if today all these countries that have seen the need to tax electronic transactions and income from digital trade, if say we were negotiating as a bloc, if the AU decided that, okay, let's come together, we see that we are losing revenue here, and given that we are still the youngest market, we stand to lose a lot more. How about we approach this thing as a bloc and we negotiate? Look at the kind of negotiations that EU is usually able to make. Literally, whoever you are, you have to comply with what the EU has agreed, tax-wise, data privacy-wise. There's very little room for negotiation. You comply or you don't do business here. That's the kind of lesson that we are yet to learn. And the sad thing is that we haven't lost much yet, because we are still a very young market. The concern is that we stand to lose a lot if we don't have such things implemented. And I think my final comment here is, just going back to what we stand to lose is this market. If we are to move based on the current trajectory of who owns much of the digital market in Africa, it's not Africans. So, well, we have, I think the biggest player we would say is Jumia. Jumia is not owned by Africans. It's headquartered in Germany. Lots of their operations are in the UAE, and currently they have the largest of the market share, because they have the Nigerian market, Egypt, Morocco, Kenya, Tunisia. Then the South African market at least has some homegrown players. But if we are going to move at the same trajectory, it's already clear that the writing is on the wall. Who's going to benefit from this? And it's also an issue of policy, because we need to be able to sort of protect local players and help to grow. It's not like we don't have homegrown like platforms that have been developed by Africans for the African market, but we don't like national governments, or even as a continent, there isn't much protection of locally developed initiatives to grow them so that they can serve the population and retain the revenues and everything else that comes with that whole ecosystem within. So there is a lot of concern policy-wise and literally in every other level.
Becky, those are really good comments. And then what Chido especially wanted to ask about that is, especially on like in WTO rules, like the national treatment, like you say, like we need a fair playing ground once, like you import goods into the country. And yet, like you have some preferences, especially on quotas and such things. So what do you think, especially from like the digital side, if like an MSME was going to be protected a bit from this competition that's coming from outside, which is going to literally sweep them under completely? What do you think? Of course, things like corruption, and stealing ideas from people, that's a difficulty, all that we have to deal with. But at least on the policy side and protecting the local entrepreneurs, what do you think about that?
That's a very important observation. But I think I must start by saying that the lack of a comprehensive regulatory framework itself actually exposes SMEs to so much abuse. Because as long as there is no, for instance, let's say we don't have competition rules and policies, it would be chaos. The business sector would be chaos because the bigger companies would be swallowing the smaller companies. So the fact that we don't have clear policies already puts SMEs at a very big disadvantage, regardless of the fact that digital trade and e-commerce is supposed to actually be opening opportunities for them to develop and grow, So the other thing that I would suggest that would probably make sense, because like we have said, we've already acknowledged the digital divide, we've already acknowledged our lack of infrastructure and our inability to quickly adapt because of financial constraints. I feel that we need to have instances where we have partnerships, right? So how how most investment laws are structured, where a country, if there is going to be foreign direct investment, it's there is a policy that actually says the foreign owned company can own so much of these shares, and the other shares are probably owned by the government or other companies that are within the country. So the good thing about having to ensure that we foster partnerships between these other big companies and the smaller companies has a lot to do with the transfer of skill and technology. And the one thing that we can do to empower the smaller businesses is through transfer of technology, through capacity building, because that has always been an issue, particularly with respect to Africa. So if we have got this these partnerships, and then there's transfer of skill, there's transfer of technology, you realize that we open up opportunities for them. They can then get to a point where they can start harnessing the available opportunities. So the problem is sometimes the opportunities are there, but we can't, like, our eyes are not opened enough to see the available opportunities. And by the time we do, we've already been exploited. And maybe to just put it out there, for MSMEs that are mainly in the services sector, I feel like there isn't so much for them to cry about with regards to e-commerce and its regulation and policies. Because if you look at the existing framework from the WTO to the last agreement, you would realize that most provisions are technological neutral. They are neutral in that they apply whether it's services that are of a physical nature. I don't even know if that makes sense. And physical and services that relates to the digital trade, right? So because of that, for a fact that every other small company that offers a service of some sort online, there is already a framework that ensures that they are protected and they are not exploited. It then becomes a different issue when you start talking about digital goods. That's when is this really big gap that we actually have to work on. So I feel like the first thing that we need to ensure, like I've said, I'm just now repeating it, there should be capacity building, right? We need to ensure that there is capacity building so that they actually start harnessing the potentials that are existing. And I wanted to say something about what Becky said, the idea that there is no value addition in the continent. It goes back again to the issue that we are lagging behind when it comes to development. And because of that, we can't then start going back to where we dropped the stick and try to run the race, because already we are trying to compete with people that are already 15 laps ahead. So what we need to do is we need to use that to our advantage, ensure that since they are going to exploit us anyway, since they are going to penetrate our markets, they are going to come in, let us get something out of it. So that by whatever that we get, we know there is transfer of technology, there is infrastructure development, right? So it's more like if we have got Google trying to make its services available, let's say in South Africa, and internet is a big issue in South Africa. We need to have Google actually come in and invest in ensuring that there are structures for internet connectivity. So you would realize that even if Gogo is to move out and move its operations out of South Africa, the physical infrastructure remains. The technological tools remain. So you remember the conversation, Christine, that we had about China, when you were saying the difference between China and all these other countries is you actually see something coming out of the exploitation. I'm going to put that in quotes. You understand? Like they come in, they sign agreements, and they reap the benefits, but ultimately we get something out of it. So that's what we need to do. And I'm very optimistic about the African Continental Free Trade Area, because part of it is to ensure that when we've opened markets, when we've created a market, we can then start developing as individual countries to make sure that we catch up with the wave or the specific stage we are at globally when it comes to industrialization.
Okay, Chido, those are very good comments, especially transport technology as a big one. Becky, if you could give your concluding remarks and any thoughts that you have on this topic, then Chido, you can do the same, and then we'll wrap this up.
Cool. I absolutely agree with Chido that the best thing that we have a lot of muscle at this point to negotiate. So first of all, we have a very big market, and it's still going to be globally the most fast growing market in every aspect, because in terms of population, while other places population is decreasing, in Africa our population growth trend is so I think we can't compete with the big players. One way or the other, they have bigger muscle. So we can use the market to our advantage to say, hey, we have the market, is going to continue to grow, but for you to do business here, this is what we require. I think policies can literally save us from this whole situation and like accelerate our growth and to take us faster where we need to be in terms of what Chido has already talked about, transfer of power and technology and everything, because at this point we can't start creating them from scratch. So I truly hope that there's a way that policy can be we already have some, they are written down. It's just a matter of implementation, and that could literally be what we need to get us where we need to be.
Chido, what are your final thoughts on this?
So I think I'm just going to raise two arguments. The first one being implementation, right? Let's quit this culture of negotiating agreements that we have no desire to implement, right? The existing legal frameworks, like the existing conventions within the AU, they need to be implemented, because some of them, they even address the issues that we're raising, the concerns that we're raising today, right? And when we start becoming very strong when it comes to implementation and actually holding each other accountable, we know for a fact that even when we start negotiating, the e-commerce protocol and all those other things under the AFTA, there is going to be implementation. It's a good culture to come up with documents, to come up with agreements. But if then they're going to, like Becky said, sit down and sit there over there and accumulate dust, we're not doing anything. We're not really progressing at the end of the day. And I wanted another thing. We need to quit this culture of individualism, right? I don't know if it's you or Becky who gave an example of the European Union. You can never go to the EU and try to negotiate an agreement with Germany or with Italy to the exclusion of all other EU members. And now that we've decided to make ourselves one single big market under the AFTA, we now need to approach all future negotiations based on that, such that when we go there and we start negotiating those preferential terms that benefit us because we have the market, as Becky said, we're doing it collectively. The problem of having to do individualism and try to negotiate individually, it has a lot to do with the fact that we can never measure up and we'll always be exploited. There is a tendency of exploiting one. You quarantine one and you exploit. So we need to actually start, laying aside the national pride that we have, lay aside all these other differences that we have. And when we start talking about issues that matter economically, we approach them on a collective basis. So it's more like so far the FTAs that have been signed between China and Morocco, UK and Kenya, the one that is brewing between the US and Kenya, they needed to have been negotiated by the 54 states that are member states of the AFTA. that way we know that whatever that we go and negotiate, I think there's a lesser level of exploitation when it's more people who are negotiating than one person. And I think also we now need to stop resisting future negotiations with regards to e-commerce, because that's where the world is going. We now need to actually be a part of the revolution, because by the time we would want to have a rude awakening call, it's going to be late. So when we go to MC12, MC13, and this whole issue of e-commerce is raised, we actually now need to understand that it is to our benefit rather than it is to our detriment as a continent.
Yeah, Chido, and I agree, and especially because for Africa, there are some the least developed countries, even if I don't like to call them that, or the very small economies. Like, they stand no chance when you want to negotiate on your own, and that's the thing. It really baffles me for especially the smaller African countries, or actually all African countries. Negotiating as a bloc helps protect your markets, but it's something. Maybe it goes back to the reason why African chiefs would sell their kids so that they can get a pair of shoes from the colonizers. It's a strange thing. We are a strange lot. But anyway, thanks everyone for listening in today, and we hope to have this and more discussions in the future. If you could share your comments and let us know what you think about these things that we're discussing about. But the whole idea is to just get people thinking, if you're an entrepreneur within Africa, like, think through some of these things, know what are the risks that you're going against and what you stand against in the next 4 or 5 years if things remain as they are within Africa, and so that it helps even plan and be strategic about the decisions that you make. Chido, thank you very much for always doing this, and Becky, thank you so much for joining us today.